I'm Macy Stevens, 26, and I put myself through law school after growing up in a house where rank came before affection. For years, I played the perfect daughter, organized their events, drove home on weekends, kept my record spotless. But when my father refused to attend my wedding because I married a civilian and my mother said, "You've dishonored our name," I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been dismissed by the people you poured yourself into? Tell me in the comments, you're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, tap like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. Growing up in our house meant understanding rank before you understood affection. My father wore his uniform like armor, even on weekends, even at birthday parties. Colonel James Stevens commanded respect from strangers and compliance from family. My mother, Patricia, orbited around his authority like a devoted adjutant, reinforcing his vision of order with her own brand of quiet insistence. Every morning started at 0600 hours. No exceptions. Beds made with hospital corners, shoes polished, posture straight. My father inspected our rooms like barracks, running his finger along surfaces for dust, checking that my school books were arranged by size. My mother stood beside him, nodding approval or disappointment based on his assessment. "Excellence isn't negotiable in this family," he'd say, hands clasped behind his back. The Stevens name means something. I learned early that love came with conditions. Good grades earned a nod. Perfect grades earned a handshake. Anything less earned lectures about wasted potential and family legacy. My father's study walls displayed his medals, commendations, photographs with generals and politicians. He'd point to them during these talks. 3 generations of military service built this reputation. You carry that responsibility. My mother reinforced these messages with softer words, but identical meaning. She'd adjust my hair before school, straightening invisible imperfections while explaining how appearance reflected character. She spoke about honor like other mothers discussed homework, weaving duty into every conversation about my future. "A woman's choices define her family's standing," she'd say, smoothing my collar. "Remember that when you're older." I absorbed these lessons completely. Through high school, I dated boys my parents approved of, studied subjects they deemed valuable, applied to colleges that would enhance our family's prestige. I never questioned their guidance because I believed their love was real, just structured differently than other families. College brought the first taste of independence, but I used it to prove my worthiness rather than explore rebellion. I chose pre-law, maintained a 3.9 GPA, joined honor societies my father could mention to his colleagues. When tuition costs strained their budget, I took out loans rather than burden them. When my mother needed help organizing military social events, I drove home weekends to assist. I measured my success by their pride, their approval, their public acknowledgement of my achievements. At military functions, my father would introduce me to other officers, listing my accomplishments like a service record. My mother would beam beside him, adding details about my dedication and character. This system worked until I realized how one-sided it had become. I gave time, energy, loyalty, perfect behavior. They gave conditional approval that could evaporate the moment my choices diverged from their vision. But I didn't recognize this imbalance yet. I was still too invested in earning their love to question whether I already deserved it. The summer before my senior year, I interned at a law firm downtown. My parents approved of this career path, seeing it as prestigious enough for a military family. They spoke about my future in terms of the connections I'd make, the status I'd achieve, the suitable husband I'd eventually attract within professional circles. During that internship, I learned something crucial about myself. I worked harder for approval than happiness, shaped my personality to match their expectations rather than discover my own preferences. I excelled at becoming what they wanted, but I'd never learned who I actually was underneath all that performance. My father's evening inspections extended beyond childhood. He'd comment on my clothes, my friends, my weekend plans, always framing his observations as guidance rather than control. My mother would echo his concerns with worried expressions, asking questions that felt caring but carried clear expectations about acceptable answers. "That boy you mentioned, "What does his father do?" she'd ask while setting dinner plates. It's important to understand someone's background before you get too involved. I provided the information they wanted, accepted their assessments of my relationships, internalized their priorities as my own. I dated the sons of officers, doctors, lawyers, men who fit their definition of suitable partners. I never wondered what I might want in a relationship beyond their approval. Looking back, I can see how thoroughly they'd train me to seek external validation rather than develop internal confidence. Every decision passed through their filter first. Every choice required their blessing to feel legitimate. I'd become expert at anticipating their reactions, adjusting my behavior to avoid disappointment, sacrificing personal desires to maintain family harmony. The Stevens family reputation became my responsibility rather than my inheritance. I carried it carefully, protecting it through perfect behavior, appropriate choices, constant vigilance about public perception. My parents had successfully created a daughter who measured her worth by their standards, who feared their disapproval more than her own unhappiness. This dynamic felt normal because it was all I'd known. Other families seemed chaotic, undisciplined, lacking the clear structure that defined our household. I pitted friends whose parents didn't provide such specific guidance about proper behavior and suitable companions. I believed our family's emphasis on tradition and hierarchy made us stronger, more focused, more successful than others. But underneath the certainty, something was shifting. College had exposed me to different perspectives, different ways of organizing family relationships, different definitions of love and support. I started noticing couples who disagreed without catastrophe, parents who offered advice without demands, families where affection didn't depend on compliance. These observations created tiny cracks in my acceptance of our family system. I began wondering what it might feel like to make choices based on personal preference rather than parental approval. I started questioning whether their vision of my future aligned with my own emerging desires and dreams. By senior year, I was maintaining perfect behavior while harboring secret doubts about the sustainability of this arrangement. I still wanted their love, still craved their pride, still feared disappointing them. But I was beginning to understand that true independence might require disappointing them eventually. I just didn't know how dramatically that test would come, or how completely it would transform our family dynamic. I was still their obedient daughter, still performing the role they'd created for me, still believing that their approval was worth any sacrifice. The betrayal that would shatter this illusion was still months away, but the foundation was already beginning to crack. The signs were subtle but persistent. My father's comments about my future began including more specific expectations about the type of man I should marry. My mother's questions about my social life became more pointed, more focused on evaluating potential suitors by military standards. They assumed my compliance would continue indefinitely, that their influence over my choices would remain absolute. They had no reason to doubt this assumption. I'd given them 22 years of perfect obedience, complete dedication to their vision of appropriate behavior. Neither of us realized how quickly that dynamic could shift once I finally met someone who made me question everything I'd been taught about love, loyalty, and what it meant to honor family while honoring myself. That reckoning was approaching faster than any of us imagined, carrying consequences none of us were prepared to handle. The first hints of trouble came during my final semester of law school. I'd started seeing someone my parents hadn't pre-approved, someone whose background didn't fit their careful criteria for suitable companionship. I hadn't introduced him yet, but I'd mentioned him enough times that their questions were becoming more pointed. "This man you keep talking about," my father said during one of our weekly phone calls. "What's his profession?" I hesitated, knowing my answer would disappoint him. "He's in business." "What kind of business?" "Import and export. International trade." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if our connection had dropped. When my father spoke again, his tone had cooled noticeably. "I see. And his family background?" This was the question I'd been dreading. "He's not from a military family, Dad." Another pause, shorter but more ominous. "I think it's time we met this young man. Your mother and I would like to evaluate his suitability." The word evaluate sent chills through me. I'd watched them assess my previous boyfriends with surgical precision, finding flaws that somehow became obvious only after they pointed them out. Their approval had always felt necessary for any relationship to continue. But something was different this time. I found myself reluctant to subject him to their judgment. "Maybe in a few weeks," I said, stalling. "Things are busy with graduation coming up." "Your final semester is exactly why we need to meet him now," my mother interjected, having joined the call. "If this relationship is serious, we need to understand what kind of future you're considering." Their concern felt less like protection and more like surveillance. For the first time, I recognized the subtle manipulation in their approach. They weren't asking to meet someone I cared about, they were demanding the right to approve or reject my choice based on criteria I'd never agreed to accept. "I'll think about it," I said, which was diplomatic code for probably not. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment feeling something I'd never experienced before: resentment toward my parents' expectations. The emotion was so unfamiliar that I almost didn't recognize it. I'd been trained to interpret their guidance as loving concern, their standards as protection from poor decisions. But their reaction to my new relationship felt different. They hadn't asked if I was happy, if he treated me well, if I felt respected and valued. They'd focused immediately on his professional status and family connections, measuring his worth by standards that had nothing to do with his character or our compatibility. Over the following weeks, their questions became more frequent and more pointed. They wanted to know where he'd gone to school, what his parents did for work, whether he had military connections, what his long-term financial prospects looked like. Each inquiry felt like an investigation rather than curiosity about someone who made their daughter happy. I found myself editing my stories about our time together, emphasizing aspects they might approve of while downplaying elements that would trigger their concern. This filtering exhausted me because it required constant translation between my actual experience and their acceptable version of reality. Meanwhile, my relationship was deepening in ways that had nothing to do with his resume or background. He listened when I talked, supported my goals without trying to reshape them, treated me as an equal partner rather than a subordinate requiring guidance. His presence in my life created a stark contrast to the hierarchical dynamic I'd accepted in my family. The more time I spent with him, the more clearly I could see how my parents' love had always been conditional. Their affection depended on my compliance, their pride required my perfect behavior, their approval came with strings attached that they could pull whenever my choices diverged from their vision. This recognition created an internal conflict I wasn't prepared to handle. I still wanted their love, still craved their approval, still feared the consequences of disappointing them. But I was beginning to understand that accepting their conditions might mean sacrificing my own happiness indefinitely. The tension came to a head during spring break when I finally brought him home to meet them. I'd prepared him for their intensity, their questions, their tendency to evaluate people by military standards rather than personal qualities. But I hadn't prepared myself for how clearly his presence would illuminate the dysfunction in our family dynamic. From the moment we walked through the door, my parents treated him with polite hostility. They asked pointed questions about his background, education, career prospects, family connections. They listened to his answers with skeptical expressions, exchanging meaningful glances when they thought we weren't watching. My father's questions felt like an interrogation, designed to expose inadequacies rather than understand character. My mother's smile never reached her eyes, and her comments carried subtle digs wrapped in false concern. "It's so interesting that you chose business instead of public service," she said during dinner. "We've always believed that serving something larger than yourself builds stronger character." I watched him handle their hostility with grace, answering their questions honestly while refusing to be intimidated by their disapproval. His composure highlighted how unreasonable their behavior had become, how their standards were designed more to maintain control than ensure my happiness. That weekend confirmed what I'd been afraid to acknowledge. My parents cared more about appearances than substance, more about maintaining their vision of family hierarchy than supporting my actual well-being. Their reaction to him wasn't based on his treatment of me or his character, it was based entirely on his failure to fit their narrow definition of acceptable companionship. After we left, I felt something shift permanently in my relationship with them. I could no longer pretend their conditional love was healthy or normal. I could no longer accept their right to approve or disapprove of my personal choices based on criteria that ignored my happiness entirely. The confrontation that would shatter our family dynamic was still months away, but the foundation had already cracked beyond repair. I just didn't realize yet how dramatically that fracture would expand, or how completely it would transform the balance of power between us. I was still hoping for their acceptance, still believing that love could overcome their prejudices. I had no idea how thoroughly they would test that faith, or how completely their betrayal would free me from caring about their approval ever again. The engagement happened 6 months after graduation. He proposed during a quiet dinner at home, no dramatic gestures or public spectacle, just a simple question about whether I wanted to spend our lives together. I said yes without hesitation, feeling certain about our future in ways I'd never experienced before. Telling my parents required weeks of preparation. I rehearsed different approaches, imagining various reactions, hoping they might surprise me with genuine happiness for my choice. I'd been naive enough to believe that seeing our relationship's stability might soften their opposition, that time would prove his worth beyond their narrow criteria. The phone call lasted exactly 4 minutes. "We're engaged," I announced after the usual pleasantries. Silence. Then my father's carefully controlled voice, "I see. Have you set a date?" "We're thinking next spring. Something small, intimate." "And you've discussed his ability to provide for you appropriately?" The question stung because it revealed how completely they'd missed the point of partnership. "We discussed our future, yes. We're both financially stable." My mother's voice joined the conversation, tight with disapproval. "Darling, marriage is about more than immediate compatibility. You need to consider long-term prospects, social standing, the kind of life you'll be able to maintain." I'd expected this reaction, but hearing it still hurt. They were reducing my life partner to a collection of credentials, measuring our love by standards that had nothing to do with happiness or mutual support. "He makes me happy," I said, which felt both true and insufficient. "Happiness isn't enough for a successful marriage," my father replied. "You need shared values, similar backgrounds, compatible goals. Military families understand duty, sacrifice, commitment in ways that civilians simply don't." The conversation continued for another minute, but I stopped listening after he dismissed my fiancé as inherently incapable of real commitment because of his civilian status. They weren't offering guidance or expressing concern. They were rejecting my choice based on prejudices that had nothing to do with reality. When I hung up, I felt hollow rather than angry. Their reaction had been predictable, but I'd still hoped for something different, some sign that my happiness mattered more than their reputation management. Over the following weeks, their opposition became more organized and strategic. They called regularly with new concerns, sent articles about divorce statistics among mixed marriages, shared stories about other military children who'd made similar mistakes and suffered predictable consequences. My mother's approach was particularly subtle. She'd call with wedding planning questions designed to highlight potential problems. "Have you thought about how different your guest lists will be? Military families and civilians have such different social expectations. What about traditions? Will he understand the importance of proper ceremony protocol? Are you sure you want to start married life with such fundamental differences in background and values?" Each conversation chipped away at my confidence, not in my relationship, but in the possibility of maintaining any positive connection with my parents. They weren't trying to understand my choice or support my happiness. They were systematically undermining my decision in hopes of changing my mind. The final conversation happened 2 weeks before the wedding. I'd called to confirm details about their travel arrangements, assuming their attendance despite their obvious disapproval. About the wedding, my father said without preamble, "Your mother and I won't be attending." The words hit like physical blows. I'd expected continued opposition, more attempts at persuasion, perhaps grudging acceptance. I hadn't expected complete abandonment. "What do you mean?" I asked, though his meaning was perfectly clear. "If you insist on marrying this man, you're making a choice that we cannot support or endorse with our presence." My mother's voice joined his, equally cold. "You've dishonored our family name with this decision. We won't participate in celebrating what we consider a mistake." The conversation ended shortly after that. No discussion of compromise, no acknowledgement of the pain their absence would cause, no recognition that they were choosing their prejudices over their daughter's happiness on the most important day of her life. I sat in my apartment afterward, processing what had just happened. My parents, who had raised me to value loyalty and commitment above all else, had just demonstrated that their love was conditional enough to withdraw entirely when my choices didn't match their vision. Their betrayal was complete. Not only would they miss my wedding, but they'd done it in a way designed to maximize hurt and humiliation. They knew their absence would generate questions from extended family, create an obvious gap in the ceremony, mark the day with their disapproval rather than their love. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free from their expectations. Their rejection was so complete, so cruel, so obviously wrong that it severed the emotional chains that had bound me to their approval. They'd overplayed their hand, pushed their control too far, revealed the ugly truth underneath their conditional love. I called my fiancé and told him what had happened. He listened without judgment, offered comfort without trying to fix the unfixable, supported my pain without minimizing its impact. His response highlighted everything my parents had failed to provide: unconditional love, genuine support, respect for my autonomy even when my choices hurt people we cared about. Their absence from our wedding would be noticed, would generate whispered conversations and uncomfortable questions. But I realized I no longer cared about protecting their reputation or managing their image. They'd chosen to prioritize their prejudices over their daughter's happiness. The consequences of that choice were theirs to handle. The betrayal was devastating but also liberating. I finally understood that their love had always been a transaction, their approval a commodity I'd been desperately trying to earn through perfect behavior. Now that they'd withdrawn both completely, I was free to build a life based on genuine relationships rather than performed compliance. I just hadn't realized yet how dramatically the power balance between us would shift once they discovered exactly who they'd rejected, or how desperately they would try to undo their mistake when social consequences began affecting their precious reputation. Their humiliation was still weeks away, but their carefully constructed superiority was about to crumble in ways they never could have imagined. The wedding took place without them. My fiancé's family filled the emotional gap their absence created, treating me with the genuine warmth I'd always hoped to receive from my own parents. His mother helped with last-minute details, his father walked me down the aisle when my own father chose not to, his siblings included me in family jokes and traditions with natural affection. The contrast was striking. Where my family had always made love feel earned, his made it feel given. Where mine had placed conditions on acceptance, his offered it freely. Where mine had demanded conformity, his celebrated difference. But their absence still hurt. Not because I needed their approval anymore, but because their choice revealed how little our relationship had meant to them when tested against their prejudices. 26 years of devotion, compliance, and loyalty had been discarded the moment my choices diverged from their vision. During the reception, relatives from my father's side approached with carefully worded questions about my parents' absence. I offered vague explanations about scheduling conflicts, protecting their reputation even as they'd abandoned me. This impulse toward loyalty frustrated me, but old habits died hard. My new husband watched these interactions with quiet understanding. He'd seen how my parents treated me, understood the dynamic better than I'd realized. After the reception, he held me while I cried for the relationship I'd lost, the parents I'd thought I knew, the family connection that had proved to be more fragile than I'd ever imagined. They made their choice, he said simply. Now you get to make yours. Over the following weeks, I processed their betrayal fully. I grieved not just their absence from my wedding, but the recognition that their love had never been what I'd believed it to be. Parents who could abandon their daughter over a marriage choice they disapproved of had never loved unconditionally in the first place. The grief was complicated because it involved mourning an illusion rather than just a relationship. I had to accept that the parents I'd thought I knew, demanding but loving, strict but caring, had been largely my own creation. The real people had always been more invested in control than connection, more committed to appearances than authenticity. But alongside the grief came freedom I'd never experienced before. For the first time, I could make choices based entirely on my own judgment. I could pursue goals that interested me rather than impress them. I could build relationships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical approval. My husband supported this transformation without trying to direct it. He listened when I wanted to talk about my parents, changed the subject when I needed distraction, gave me space to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to maintain with them going forward. 3 months after the wedding, I'd settled into a routine that didn't include them. I'd stopped calling for their approval of my decisions, stopped seeking their validation for my choices, stopped measuring my success by their standards. The silence felt strange initially, but it also felt peaceful. I'd started developing my own opinions about politics, career goals, social issues, lifestyle choices. Without their constant commentary, I discovered preferences I'd never known I had, interests I'd suppressed to avoid their disapproval, dreams I'd abandoned to fit their vision of appropriate ambition. This period of self-discovery was interrupted by news from extended family about my parents' social situation. Word was spreading through military circles about their absence from my wedding, generating exactly the kind of gossip and speculation they'd always worked to avoid. Other officers' wives were asking pointed questions about why they hadn't attended their only daughter's wedding. The explanations they offered, concerns about timing, scheduling conflicts, family obligations, sounded increasingly hollow as weeks passed without any mention of reconciliation or future visits. Their carefully maintained reputation was beginning to suffer from the very choice they'd made to protect it. By refusing to attend my wedding to preserve their standards, they'd created exactly the kind of social scrutiny they'd always feared. People were beginning to question what kind of parents would skip their daughter's wedding over something as minor as the groom's profession. But I wasn't ready to feel satisfaction about their discomfort. The hurt was still too fresh, the betrayal too complete. I was focused on building my new life rather than monitoring the consequences of their choices. They'd made their priorities clear, and I was learning to live without caring about their approval or their reputation. The transformation was gradual but profound. Without their expectations shaping my decisions, I started discovering who I actually was underneath all that performed perfection. I liked this version of myself better, more authentic, more confident, more willing to take risks and make mistakes without catastrophic consequences. My marriage was thriving in ways that had nothing to do with external validation. We made decisions together, supported each other's goals, handled conflicts without involving outside authorities. The partnership felt genuinely equal in ways I'd never experienced before. I was beginning to understand that the most valuable thing my parents had given me wasn't their love or approval, but their complete withdrawal of both. Their betrayal had forced me to develop independence I might never have achieved otherwise, to build confidence based on internal rather than external validation. Their rejection had been cruel, but it had also been clarifying. I finally understood that relationships based on conditional love weren't worth maintaining at any cost. Their absence from my life was painful, but it was also liberating in ways I was only beginning to appreciate. The phone call that would change everything was still weeks away, but I was already becoming someone they wouldn't recognize, someone who measured success by happiness rather than hierarchy, who valued authenticity over approval, who understood that real love didn't come with conditions or prerequisites. Their betrayal had accidentally given me the greatest gift possible, freedom from needing their acceptance to feel worthy of love. I was learning to live without them, building a life they'd never have approved of, but that made me genuinely happy. I had no idea they were about to discover the cost of their prejudices, or how desperately they would try to undo the damage once they realized exactly who they'd rejected and what that rejection might cost them socially. The photo wasn't planned as revenge. 6 months after our wedding, my husband and I were spending a weekend on his yacht, something we'd done regularly since our honeymoon. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, and I'd impulsively snapped a picture of him at the helm, relaxed and smiling, the sun catching the brass fittings and polished wood of the deck behind him. Looking at the image later, I realized it perfectly captured something about him I'd never been able to explain to my parents. He looked completely at ease, confident without arrogance, successful without ostentation. The yacht itself was visible in the background, not the focus of the photo, just context for his natural composure. I stared at that picture for a long time, thinking about their dismissive comments about his profession, their assumptions about his prospects, their certainty that he was somehow beneath our family's standards. The irony was almost funny. They'd rejected him based on titles and credentials while remaining completely ignorant of his actual circumstances. My husband had never discussed his wealth with them because they'd never shown interest in him as a person. Their questions had focused on his background and profession, not his achievements or character. They'd been so invested in dismissing him that they'd never bothered to learn who he actually was. The decision to send them the photo happened impulsively, during a moment of exhausted frustration with their ongoing silence. They hadn't called since before the wedding, hadn't acknowledged our marriage or inquired about our well-being. Their complete indifference to my happiness had crystallized into something that felt like cruelty. I attached the photo to a brief text message. Thought you might like to see how we're doing. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, just a simple update from their daughter, who they'd abandoned for making an unsuitable choice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone started ringing within minutes, first my mother, then my father, then both of them on repeated callback attempts when I didn't answer immediately. Text messages flooded in, each more panicked than the last. Call us immediately. We need to talk to you. This is urgent. Why didn't you tell us? Their sudden desperation was almost comical after months of complete silence. The photo had achieved something I'd never intended. It had forced them to confront the reality of their mistake in terms they couldn't ignore or rationalize away. When I finally answered their call, my mother's voice was shaking with what sounded like panic mixed with excitement. Why didn't you tell us about the yacht? She demanded without preamble. You never asked, I replied calmly. You were too busy explaining why he was unsuitable for our family. But we didn't know, my father interjected. You should have told us about his financial situation. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, but the themes remained consistent. They kept emphasizing what they didn't know, what I hadn't told them, what they hadn't understood about his true circumstances. Never once did they acknowledge that their rejection had been based on prejudice rather than facts, that their absence from our wedding had been cruel regardless of his financial status. We want to make this right, my mother said eventually. We made a mistake. What mistake was that? I asked, genuinely curious about how they would frame their betrayal. We should have gotten to know him better before making any judgments. It was a carefully worded non-apology that avoided acknowledging the real issue. They weren't sorry for their prejudice. They were sorry for misjudging someone who turned out to be wealthy enough to embarrass them socially. Their concern wasn't about the pain they'd caused me, but about the damage to their reputation once word spread about their daughter's obviously successful marriage. Over the following days, their attempts at reconciliation became more frantic. They called repeatedly, sent flowers, left voicemails explaining how much they missed me and wanted to repair our relationship. But every conversation revealed that their motivation was social rather than emotional. They were terrified that other military families would learn about their absence from my wedding once news of my husband's wealth became common knowledge. Their rejection of him would look foolish rather than principled, petty rather than protective. They needed reconciliation not because they missed me, but because their reputation required it. The photo had accidentally exposed the hollow core of their value system. They measured people by wealth and status, not character or kindness. They'd rejected my husband based on incomplete information about his financial situation, and now they were trying to embrace him for the same superficial reasons. But the damage was already done. Their panic about social consequences revealed exactly how little genuine love had motivated their choices. If they'd cared about my happiness, they would have attended my wedding regardless of his profession. If they'd loved me unconditionally, they would have apologized for their cruelty rather than their ignorance. The reversal was so complete and so obviously self-serving that it destroyed any remaining hope I'd harbored about the authenticity of their affection. They weren't trying to rebuild a relationship with their daughter, they were trying to manage a social crisis that their prejudices had created. I found myself feeling sorry for them rather than angry. Their desperation was genuine, but it was motivated by fear of embarrassment rather than love for their child. They were discovering that their careful reputation management had backfired spectacularly, that their absence from my wedding now looked like a massive error in judgment rather than principled stand. The photo had done more than reveal my husband's wealth, it had revealed the true nature of my parents' priorities. They were willing to abandon their daughter to maintain their prejudices, but they were also willing to abandon those same prejudices to maintain their social standing. Neither choice had anything to do with genuine care for my well-being. Their transformation from rejection to desperate acceptance happened too quickly to feel authentic. 6 months of silence, followed by frantic attempts at reconciliation based solely on new information about his financial status. The timing made their motivations impossible to disguise or deny. I realized that sending the photo had been a test I hadn't consciously designed. Their reaction told me everything I needed to know about whether genuine reconciliation was possible. They'd failed that test completely, revealing that their love remained as conditional as ever, just based on different conditions now. The power dynamic between us had shifted permanently. They needed me now more than I needed them, needed my forgiveness to restore their social standing, needed my acceptance to undo the damage their prejudices had caused. But I was no longer interested in managing their reputation or protecting them from the consequences of their choices. They'd taught me to value appearances over authenticity, to measure relationships by external validation rather than internal satisfaction. Now they were discovering what happened when those lessons were applied to their own behavior. The photo had simply made visible what had always been true about their priorities. I wasn't ready to feel victorious about their discomfort, but I also wasn't ready to rescue them from the situation they'd created. They'd made their choice based on their values, and now they were experiencing the consequences of those values. The photo had simply accelerated a reckoning that was probably inevitable. Their struggle was just beginning, but mine was finally ending. I no longer needed their approval or feared their disapproval. The photo had accidentally proven that their judgment was worthless, their standards were shallow, and their love was too conditional to be worth pursuing. That clarity was worth more than any revenge I could have planned. The social consequences for my parents unfolded gradually over the following months. Military wives who had initially supported their principled stand began asking more pointed questions once details about my husband's background became common knowledge. The narrative shifted from protecting family standards to missing an advantageous connection through poor judgment. At officers' club events, conversations would pause when my mother entered rooms. Other wives would exchange meaningful glances when she tried to participate in discussions about their children's marriages and achievements. Her absence from my wedding, once seen as admirable dedication to military values, was being reframed as a social and strategic error. My father faced subtler, but equally damaging consequences. His colleagues began making casual comments about family relationships, about the importance of supporting children's choices, about how military leadership required adaptability and good judgment in personal as well as professional situations. No one accused him directly, but the implications were clear. They'd built their reputation on being the kind of parents whose standards commanded respect. Now those same standards were being questioned as rigid, outdated, possibly even destructive to family unity. The very hierarchy they'd used to justify their behavior was now being used to critique their judgment. The panic in their repeated phone calls became more desperate as weeks passed. They could sense their standing eroding, but couldn't figure out how to stop it without acknowledging mistakes they weren't prepared to admit. Every attempt at contact revealed their growing social isolation. People are asking questions, my mother said during one particularly tense conversation. They want to know why we haven't visited, why we haven't talked about your marriage, why we seem disconnected from your life. What do you tell them? I asked. We say we've been giving you space to adjust to married life, but that excuse is wearing thin. We need to present a united family front. The phrase united family front was telling. They weren't interested in repairing our relationship. They wanted to create the appearance of family harmony to protect their reputation. Their concern was purely tactical, focused on damage control rather than genuine reconciliation. During another call, my father's frustration with the situation became more obvious. This whole misunderstanding has gotten out of hand, he said. We need to put it behind us and move forward. What misunderstanding? I asked. About your husband's background, his prospects, his suitability as a partner. We were working with incomplete information. Again, They were framing their betrayal as a simple mistake rather than a revelation of their true priorities. They couldn't acknowledge that their reaction had been wrong regardless of his financial status, because that would require admitting their value system was fundamentally flawed. Their attempts at reconciliation followed predictable patterns. They invited us for dinner, suggested family vacations, offered to host parties in our honor. Every gesture was designed to create visible evidence of family unity that could be shared with their social circle. But their invitations revealed how little they understood about the damage they'd caused. They assumed that acknowledging his wealth would automatically repair the relationship, that their acceptance now would erase their rejection then. They couldn't comprehend that their betrayal had been about more than just poor judgment, it had been about conditional love. I watched their struggle with a mixture of sadness and detachment. They were experiencing consequences they'd never anticipated, learning that reputation management could backfire when it conflicted with basic family loyalty. Their careful image was crumbling, but they still couldn't understand why forgiveness wasn't immediately forthcoming. The transformation was particularly difficult for my mother, who had built her identity around being the perfect military wife and mother. Her social circle was small and tightly knit, making their whispered criticism especially painful. She'd expected other wives to admire her principled stand, but instead they were questioning her maternal instincts. My father's situation was more complex, but equally uncomfortable. His professional success had always been enhanced by his reputation as a devoted family man whose personal life reflected the same discipline and integrity he brought to his military service. Colleagues were beginning to question whether someone who couldn't maintain basic family relationships possessed the judgment required for higher command positions. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd spent my entire childhood teaching me that actions have consequences, that personal choices reflect character, that reputation was earned through consistent behavior over time. Now they were learning these lessons themselves in the most painful way possible. Their social isolation deepened as months passed without visible reconciliation. Other military families began excluding them from informal gatherings, uncertain about how to navigate the obvious tension surrounding their daughter's absence from family events. Invitations became less frequent, conversations more stilted, their previously central social position increasingly marginal. I heard about their struggles through relatives who remained in contact with both sides of the family conflict. These reports painted a picture of two people who had overestimated their social standing and underestimated the importance of family loyalty to their community's values. The military culture they'd embraced so completely actually worked against them in this situation. Military families understood sacrifice, deployment separations, the challenges of maintaining relationships across distance and duty assignments. But they also valued loyalty, commitment, showing up for family members regardless of personal disagreements. My parents' absence from my wedding violated this core value in ways that became more obvious as time passed. Other families began sharing stories of weddings they'd attended despite reservations about the spouse, grandchildren they'd embraced despite different backgrounds, relationships they'd maintained despite philosophical differences. Their rigid standards, once admired as principled dedication, were being reframed as inflexible pride that damaged family bonds. The contrast between their behavior and community expectations became increasingly stark as their isolation deepened. But the most painful consequence wasn't social, it was personal. They were discovering what it felt like to lose access to someone they loved, to have their calls go unanswered, to be excluded from important life events. They were experiencing the same abandonment they'd inflicted on me, but without the option of reversing their decision through simple acknowledgement of error. I wasn't intentionally punishing them, but I also wasn't interested in pretending their betrayal hadn't happened. Their panic about social consequences revealed that their priorities hadn't fundamentally changed. They still cared more about appearances than authenticity, more about reputation than relationships. Their desperation grew more obvious with each attempted contact. Voice messages became longer and more pleading, emails more frequent and emotional, their attempts at manipulation more transparent. They offered everything except the one thing that might have mattered: genuine acknowledgement of how their conditional love had damaged our relationship. The struggle was transforming them in ways they didn't seem to recognize. My confident, authoritative father was becoming uncertain and defensive. My socially adept mother was becoming anxious and isolated. Their carefully constructed superiority was crumbling under the weight of their own poor judgment. I found myself feeling sorry for them while also recognizing that this experience might be the first genuine consequence they'd ever faced for their rigid worldview. They'd spent decades believing that their standards were superior, their judgment infallible, their approach to family relationships admirable and effective. Now they were learning that their methods could backfire catastrophically, that their reputation could be damaged by the very behaviors they'd thought would protect it. The lesson was painful, but probably necessary for any genuine growth to occur. Their transformation wasn't complete yet, but the foundation was shifting. They were beginning to understand that relationships require more than hierarchy and control, that love demands more than compliance and performance. Whether they could internalize these lessons remained to be seen. The social consequences were just the beginning of their struggle. The deeper challenge would be acknowledging that their entire approach to family relationships had been fundamentally flawed, that their conditional love had been more damaging than protective. That reckoning was still ahead of them, and it would prove much more difficult than managing their reputation. I was no longer invested in their struggle, but I couldn't help observing it with a mixture of sadness and fascination. They were experiencing consequences they'd never anticipated, learning lessons they'd never been forced to confront. Their pain was real, but so was their responsibility for creating the situation they were now desperate to escape. The power dynamic between us had reversed completely, but I wasn't interested in using that power to punish them further. I'd moved beyond needing their approval or fearing their disapproval. Their struggle was their own to navigate, just as my healing had been mine to manage. The relationship they'd damaged might never be fully repaired, but at least it was finally honest about its limitations. The calls from my parents continued sporadically over the following year, but with decreasing frequency and intensity. They seemed to gradually accept that their initial strategy of desperate reconciliation wasn't working, that I wasn't going to pretend their betrayal hadn't happened simply to restore their social comfort. Their approach shifted from panic to bargaining. They began offering specific gestures designed to demonstrate their acceptance of my marriage: invitations to family events, suggestions for joint vacations, offers to host dinner parties in our honor. Each proposal was carefully calculated to provide visible evidence of family unity while requiring minimal acknowledgement of their past behavior. I declined most of these invitations politely but firmly. The gestures felt hollow because they addressed symptoms rather than causes, focused on appearances rather than genuine relationship repair. They wanted to skip past accountability directly to reconciliation, but healing doesn't work that way. Occasionally, I would accept smaller overtures, a brief phone call, a holiday card exchange, minimal contact that maintained basic civility without pretending our relationship was healthy. These interactions were stilted and superficial, both sides carefully avoiding topics that might trigger conflict or require honest discussion of past events. During one of these conversations, my mother made a comment that revealed how little she understood about what needed to happen for real reconciliation. "I don't know why you're still upset about the wedding," she said. "That was over a year ago. We've acknowledged that we made a mistake about his background. Isn't it time to move past it?" The question demonstrated exactly why our relationship remained damaged. She was framing their betrayal as a simple error in judgment about his qualifications rather than a fundamental failure of love and loyalty. She wanted forgiveness, without understanding what needed to be forgiven. "The issue wasn't his background," I explained. "The issue was your willingness to abandon me over a decision you disapproved of." "We were trying to protect you," she replied, falling back on familiar justifications. "You were trying to control me. When that didn't work, you punished me." These conversations rarely progressed beyond surface-level acknowledgement of mistakes and misunderstandings. They couldn't or wouldn't engage with the deeper issues that had caused the rift: their conditional love, their controlling behavior, their prioritization of reputation over relationship. Meanwhile, my life was thriving without their involvement. My marriage had deepened into something beautiful and stable, built on mutual respect rather than hierarchical approval. My career was progressing based on my own goals rather than their expectations. I was discovering interests and values I'd never been free to explore while seeking their approval. The contrast between my flourishing independence and their ongoing struggle with social consequences became more pronounced over time. They were still dealing with whispered criticism and reduced invitations, still trying to manage the damage to their reputation, still learning how completely their rigid standards had backfired. I heard occasional updates through relatives about their situation. My father had been passed over for a promotion that everyone expected him to receive. The official reasons were never explicitly stated, but timing suggested that questions about his judgment and leadership style may have influenced the decision. Military leadership requires emotional intelligence and relationship management skills that his personal choices had called into question. My mother's social isolation had deepened rather than improved. Other military wives had initially been sympathetic to her principled stand, but as time passed without reconciliation, their support shifted to criticism. They began questioning what kind of mother would maintain a grudge against her own daughter over something as minor as spouse selection. Their struggles weren't bringing me satisfaction, but they also weren't motivating me to rescue them from consequences they'd created through their own choices. I'd learned to separate their pain from my responsibility, to feel compassion without feeling obligated to fix problems I hadn't caused. The transformation in my own life was profound and ongoing. Without their constant commentary and approval-seeking, I'd developed confidence based on internal rather than external validation. I made decisions based on my values rather than their expectations, chose goals that fulfilled me rather than impressed them. My relationship with my husband had become the model for how healthy partnerships should function. We disagreed without catastrophe, supported each other's goals without trying to control them, made major decisions through discussion rather than hierarchy. The contrast with my parents' approach to family relationships was striking. I'd also developed friendships based on genuine connection rather than strategic networking. Without my parents' influence, I'd learned to value authenticity over status, kindness over credentials, mutual support over competitive advantage. My social circle was smaller, but much more genuine than the connections I'd maintained while seeking their approval. The healing process was gradual but real. I was learning to trust my own judgment, to value my own opinions, to measure success by happiness rather than hierarchy. The freedom was intoxicating after a lifetime of performance and approval-seeking. Occasionally, I would feel sadness about the relationship we'd lost, but I was also grateful for the relationship I'd escaped. Their conditional love had been more prison than protection, their standards more limiting than elevating. Their betrayal had accidentally freed me from bonds I hadn't recognized as restrictive. The question of whether reconciliation was possible remained open, but I was no longer interested in pursuing it actively. If they wanted a genuine relationship, they would need to do the work of understanding why their behavior had been damaging and take responsibility for changing their approach. I was no longer willing to manage their emotions or protect them from the consequences of their choices. Their struggle continued, but mine was ending. I'd found peace with the situation, acceptance of their limitations, and freedom from needing their approval to feel worthy of love. The betrayal that had once devastated me had ultimately become the catalyst for developing genuine self-worth and authentic relationships. The power dynamic had shifted permanently, but I wasn't interested in using that power to punish or control them. I'd learned better models for handling relationships from my marriage and friendships, models based on respect and support rather than manipulation and conditional approval. Their approach had damaged our family, but it had also taught me exactly what I didn't want to replicate in my own relationships. The resolution came 3 years after my wedding, not through dramatic confrontation or tearful reconciliation, but through a gradual settling into new patterns that acknowledged reality rather than fighting it. My parents slowly accepted that their previous relationship with me was gone permanently, that any future connection would need to be built on different terms entirely. The process began with a letter from my father, surprisingly direct and uncharacteristically humble. He wrote about his regrets regarding my wedding, his recognition that their absence had been wrong regardless of their concerns, and his desire to rebuild our relationship on terms I would find acceptable. The letter was different from their previous attempts at reconciliation because it focused on their behavior rather than their misunderstanding of my husband's qualifications. For the first time, he acknowledged that the issue had been their conditional love rather than incomplete information about his background. "I realize now that our absence from your wedding was unforgivable," he wrote. "Not because we misjudged your husband's worth, but because we failed to support you when you needed us most. A parent's job is to love unconditionally, and we failed that test completely." The acknowledgement felt genuine in ways their previous apologies hadn't. He wasn't trying to minimize their betrayal or shift responsibility to misunderstandings. He was accepting that their behavior had been wrong and their priorities had been damaged. He proposed a different kind of relationship going forward, one where they offered support without demanding control, where they expressed opinions without expecting compliance, where they demonstrated love through presence rather than performance. The terms were exactly what I would have proposed if asked. My mother's separate letter was shorter, but equally significant. She wrote about her regret at missing my wedding day, her sadness at losing daily contact with me, and her understanding that their rigid standards had damaged our family more than protected it. "I spent so much time worrying about what other people would think that I forgot to consider what you needed from us," she wrote. "I'm learning that real honor comes from supporting your children, not controlling them." Both letters avoided self-pity while acknowledging genuine remorse. They didn't ask for immediate forgiveness or demand restored intimacy, but they offered accountability and commitment to different behavior going forward. The tone was respectful rather than demanding, patient rather than urgent. I responded cautiously but positively, agreeing to limited contact with clear boundaries. We would start with occasional phone calls, progress gradually to face-to-face meetings, and build trust slowly through consistent behavior rather than grand gestures. I made it clear that this would be a lengthy process requiring sustained effort on their part. The first conversations were awkward but encouraging. They asked about my life without immediately offering unsolicited advice. They listened to my concerns without becoming defensive. They shared updates about their own situation without expecting sympathy for consequences they'd created through their choices. My husband participated in some of these conversations, offering his own perspective on family relationships and conflict resolution. His presence seemed to help them understand what they'd missed by rejecting him initially, not just his wealth or status, but his character and the stability he brought to my life. Gradually, very slowly, we began developing a different kind of relationship. They were more subdued than before, less certain of their own judgment, more willing to ask questions than make pronouncements. The change felt genuine because it was sustained over months rather than performed for immediate effect. We met for dinner occasionally, visited each other's homes carefully, included each other in some family events with appropriate boundaries. The interactions were pleasant but not deeply intimate, civil but not completely comfortable. We were learning to be family members rather than trying to recreate the parent-child dynamic that had been so damaged. The reconciliation wasn't complete and probably never would be. Too much had happened for us to pretend the betrayal hadn't occurred or return to our previous relationship patterns. But we were building something new that acknowledged reality while allowing for connection within appropriate limits. My parents had learned painful lessons about the consequences of conditional love, rigid standards, and prioritizing reputation over relationship. They were different people now, less arrogant, more uncertain, genuinely humbled by the experience of losing their daughter's respect and affection. I had learned equally valuable lessons about independence, self-worth, and the difference between healthy and unhealthy family dynamics. Their betrayal had forced me to develop strength I might never have needed otherwise, to build confidence based on internal rather than external validation. The yacht photo that had triggered their panic 3 years earlier seemed almost irrelevant now. It had served its purpose by revealing their superficial priorities and forcing a reckoning with their behavior. But the real issue had never been about wealth or status. It had been about love, loyalty, and respect. My marriage continued thriving, built on the foundation of mutual support and unconditional acceptance I'd never experienced before meeting my husband. He'd shown me what healthy relationships looked like, how partners could disagree without abandoning each other, how love could exist without conditions or performance requirements. The contrast between my marriage and my childhood family dynamic remained striking. Where my parents had demanded compliance, my husband encouraged independence. Where they had offered conditional approval, he provided unconditional support. Where they had prioritized appearances, he valued authenticity. This difference had made their betrayal both more painful and ultimately more liberating. It had shown me clearly what I'd been missing, what I deserved in relationships, and what I would never accept again from people who claimed to love me. The resolution wasn't perfect, but it was honest. We were family members who cared about each other within appropriate limits, who had learned from past mistakes, who had grown from painful experiences. The relationship we'd built wasn't the one any of us had expected, but it was probably healthier than what we'd had before. My parents had lost their controlling influence over my life permanently, but they'd gained something potentially more valuable, a daughter who respected them for acknowledging their mistakes and working to become better people. The hierarchy that had once defined our relationship was gone, replaced by mutual respect between adults who had chosen to maintain family connections despite past conflicts. The real inheritance they'd given me wasn't money or status, but the knowledge of what I wouldn't tolerate in relationships and the strength to maintain boundaries even with people I loved. Their conditional love had accidentally taught me the value of unconditional acceptance. Their rigid standards had shown me the importance of flexibility and growth. Years later, looking back on the whole experience, I could see how their betrayal had been both devastating and transformative. It had ended one kind of relationship permanently while making better relationships possible. Their absence from my wedding had been cruel, but their presence might have prevented me from developing the independence I'd needed to become fully myself. The yacht, the photo, the panic, the reconciliation, all of it had been part of a larger story about love, loyalty, growth, and the complex ways that families can both damage and heal each other over time. We'd all emerged changed from the experience, hopefully wiser and definitely more honest about the conditions under which we could maintain healthy connections. The final lesson was perhaps the most important. Boundaries aren't barriers to love, but frameworks that make love sustainable. Setting limits with my parents hadn't destroyed our relationship, it had made a different kind of relationship possible, one based on respect rather than control, choice rather than obligation, mutual benefit rather than one-sided performance. Real wealth, I'd learned, wasn't measured in yachts or status symbols, but in the freedom to be authentic, to choose relationships that enhanced rather than diminished your sense of self, and to love people not despite their flaws, but within appropriate recognition of their limitations. That freedom was worth more than any inheritance, more valuable than any approval, and more lasting than any reputation built on others' conditional acceptance. The story reached its final chapter 5 years after our wedding, when my husband and I announced we were expecting our first child. The news created another test of the fragile relationship I'd rebuilt with my parents, another opportunity for them to demonstrate whether their growth was genuine or merely performed for social rehabilitation. Their response was immediate but measured. My mother called within hours of receiving our announcement, her voice carefully controlled but unmistakably excited. "This is wonderful news," she said. "How are you feeling? Do you need anything?" The questions were simple, practical, focused on my well-being rather than their own reactions or expectations. No immediate assumptions about their role as grandparents, no demands for specific involvement, no attempts to insert themselves into our family planning decisions. The restraint felt genuine rather than calculated. My father's reaction was similarly appropriate. He expressed happiness for us, offered general support, asked thoughtful questions about our preparations. He avoided making any presumptions about grandparent privileges or traditional family roles that might need to be navigated carefully given our history. Over the following months, they demonstrated remarkable patience with the boundaries we maintained around our pregnancy. They asked for updates without demanding constant communication. They offered help without expecting automatic acceptance. They expressed excitement without overwhelming us with their own agendas for the future. The contrast with their previous behavior was profound. Where they had once demanded control over my life decisions, they now waited to be included in whatever capacity we found appropriate. Where they had once offered conditional approval, They now provided unconditional support within the limits we had established. When our daughter was born, they drove to the hospital immediately but waited in the lobby until we invited them upstairs. They held their granddaughter with obvious joy but returned her without reluctance when visiting time ended. They took photographs respectfully, asked permission before sharing news with their friends, respected our wishes about privacy and timing. The transformation was most evident in small moments. My mother helped with practical tasks without criticizing our parenting choices. My father played with his granddaughter without offering unsolicited advice about child rearing. They were present without being overwhelming, supportive without being controlling. Their relationship with my husband had evolved into something approaching genuine respect. He included them in family discussions naturally, sought their opinions on appropriate matters, treated them as valued family members rather than former antagonists. The ease of these interactions suggested that time and consistent behavior had healed wounds that once seemed permanent. Watching my parents with their granddaughter revealed the people they might have been all along if their rigid standards hadn't interfered with their capacity for unconditional love. They were gentle, patient, genuinely delighted by her presence without needing to shape her development according to their vision of appropriate behavior. The military community that had once questioned their judgment now saw them as devoted grandparents who had successfully navigated family conflict to maintain important relationships. Their reputation had been restored not through manipulation or explanation, but through sustained demonstration of growth and changed priorities. But the most significant change was internal rather than social. They seemed more at peace with themselves, less driven by external validation, more focused on genuine relationships than strategic positioning. The crisis that had nearly destroyed our family had ultimately forced them to examine and modify their approach to love, loyalty, and what it meant to be family. That's my story. If it resonated, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs stronger boundaries. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged for who you chose to love? Would you forgive parents who skipped your wedding? Why or why not? What's one boundary you set that changed a family dynamic? If you were me, what would rebuilding trust look like? Drop your answers in the comments. Your experience could help someone else.